particularly in patients and subjects of experimentation. On the other hand, the UNESCO chair from the very beginning has been working in multicultural and multi-religious environments, and we think that beyond an individualistic and Western vision of informed consent that has been focused to fill up the form, to sign the form, there are sociocultural and communitarian approaches that might call the attention about the social and contextual factors that should be properly taken into consideration, offering in this project innovative guidelines to improving the best practices known of informed consent in clinical trials. Informed consent presupposes a level of individual autonomy that can be challenged and at the same time stimulated by developments in neuroscience and neurotechnology through the increasing knowledge of the decision-making process on subjects of experimentation. This knowledge might allow to understand the wiring and function of the most complex and intricate mechanism in the human body and the networks of 90 billion nerve cells working together to produce perception, action, cognition, and emotions. But on the other hand, we have realized also this morning about that the effective decision-making is not possible without the motivation and meaning provided by emotional input. Decisions rely on information gathered previously, like a memory, which is weighted with the current flow of information, the sensory perception, consideration of the possible alternative and reasoning to reach a final decision, usually resulting in an action or a lack thereof. Feelings, therefore, provide the basis for human reason. And then brain-damaged patients, vulnerable patients, left devoid of emotion, struggle to make the most elementary decisions. Autonomy is certainly very important in the evaluation of informed consent, but the UNESCO approved in 2005 the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, that is our colleagues of the LUMSA, I'm sure, have been studying. That is a soft law instrument, but where autonomy and the protection and the need of informed consent, especially in vulnerable populations or people that have not the capacity to consent, it's only one of the principles to be taken into consideration. And I think that this approach to neuroscience and neurotechnology or neurobioethical dimension of informed consent can be focused, as this morning we have been discussing a little bit, not only about the individualistic approach, but also a social approach where the individual, with the person, is in relation with the others, and how this relation with the proxies and family and the whole society and the state and the world in general can impact in the decision-making process. In the working document, we have presented different visions of autonomy as freedom to have one's will respected according to the libertarian approach, as consistency with past decisions, validity. I would like to focus very briefly in this last point, because I think the contribution to I consent could be exactly in this area. We have been talking a little bit this morning. On the one hand, how or to what extent for a lawyer and for an ethicist it's important to be sure that this process of informed consent that is not, as Father Alberto mentioned this morning, one event, but it's a process, how the neural basis of decision-making process work, which are the neurobiological determinants of decisions. I think this is important to know better and to see to what extent this knowledge, these technologies can help us to have a more accurate understanding of the decision-making process from a biological point of view. In the light of this knowledge, I think we have also to evaluate that the research that has been done so far, it seems to be done on very simple tests about this decision-making process, and that all the information, comprehension, understanding, deliberation, and decision, all this process is not a simple process. So this complexity should also be addressed by the experts in the field, so that we can have a thorough knowledge, not only to be sure that informed consent is perfect, or that the people is, as this morning mentioned Dr. De Caro, fully autonomous or fully competent. But the challenge is, from an ethical point of view, to what extent we can have the moral certainty that the experimentation that is proposed to a subject of experimentation has sufficient capacity to sign the form and to continue in all the process of the experimentation to hold this approval, this support of the decision he or she took from the very beginning. In literature, I have found something that I'm not an expert, and I call your attention. In an article, interesting article, that is the Neurobiology of Decision-Making and Responsibility, Reconciling and Mindedness, written by Adina Roskis and Michael Sadlin. And Shadlin has other papers on that. And he talks about the relevance of noise, understood as something that goes beyond the biological. This is my understanding as a lawyer, I'm sorry. So please help me. It's beyond the biological and measurable facts of our cognitive processes. There are other elements like values, like attitudes, like they call policies. And that is not referred to politicians, it's policies. It's like something that we cannot measure, but that is present due to the relation with the context and with the environment. And this is for the UNESCO chair in the project is very important, because as we have in the fourth question of the working packet, the working document, it says the cultural biases have been proven to exist also at a neuronal level. In which way should we filter such an information in relation to informed consent? So, if we want to offer the European Union some insights or guidelines, we can, we can offer some neurobiological and neuroscientific information that takes into consideration not only the part that we know better today, that is the cognitive function, but also what this morning has been mentioned about the emotional in an integrated way to have a more thorough and accurate vision of men and women, and not only the brain and the mind, the soul of the individual, but how the cultural and social, multi-religious factors can influence to say yes to this proposal of participating in a clinical trial or no. And that's one of the things that as a lawyer, I would like to also to to be attentive, to see if the best practices in eye consent can be improved by considering the role of science, technology, and also, of course, of different cultural and religious diversity. This morning was also very illuminating for me to understand better the different impairments that can make people vulnerable, especially due to mental disorder, the different mental disorders and mood disorders. But it remains for me yet the doubt and the need to go deeper to understand how we can not exclude these people that have an impossibility probably to give consent, but how we can involve them, number one, for their own benefit, and when they need a kind of subsidiary or support from someone else so that they are not excluded from the research, especially when we are talking about the research, the biomedical research of drugs that can and should benefit them. So at the very end, and I conclude, I think the main challenge for our UNESCO chair in this task, on the one hand, would be how we can know more in detail this mechanism on the neurobiological mechanisms of the decision-making process. And on the other hand, not to be idealistic, as this morning mentioned Dr. Picaro, think that we have to guarantee the best, the optimal, or the excellent information for the patient. So we need both. Accurate, sufficient information, but then it's a bi-directional, as Father Alberto mentioned. So far, and I talk as a lawyer, and I mentioned at the beginning, the law has been worried about how to guarantee the physicians and researchers they are not going to be legally challenged. But from an ethical point of view, we have the moral responsibility to find ways to improve the process of informed consent, not only by using new forms is necessary, but how to educate people to be subject of experimentation, how we can educate and illustrate better physicians and researchers about the importance of this bi-directional process, and how we can understand that for the good of people, for the good of the society in general, this kind of process can be more and more accurate and harmonized. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. Now, the group from LUMSA, we have Dana, there's Pieri, Leonardo Neppi, and Margita Raverio, and they have 20 minutes also to explain to us their part in this work in the consortium. Richard.
Thank you. Our team is involved in eye consent project, dealing with overall the legal aspects of informed consent and vulnerable people. Today we draft some comments moving from the fourth definition of autonomy. Autonomy as capacity to choose validly, and according to our research interests, we divided our work. So I will deal with problems concerning minors, Loredana Persampieri with issues concerning vulnerable groups. Oh, sorry, Margherita with issues concerning vulnerable groups, and Loredana with issues concerning multiculturalism and neuroscience. Dealing with issues concerning minors, age-related issues, informed consent process, ethics and regulations are based on the idea that competent decisions should be respected, which means that competence is a major factor to take into account from an ethical and a legal point of view when assessing if informed consent is valid. In this field, minors' condition is actually an ethical and legal issue because of the low competence on one hand and continuous development on the other hand. And dealing with clinical trials, we have to keep in mind also that we have a duty to protect minors on one hand, and from the other point of view, the need to gain knowledge about the minor's condition. So this balance is challenging for ethics and law. But when we can consider competent a minor? Being a minor, in fact, is a legal status, and the age of adulthood is conventionally fixed by the law. Any classification of the pediatric population into age categories is to some extent arbitrary, because it does not consider personal development. So without fixing rigid age thresholds, we could consider autonomous children and young people who potentially have the intellectual capacity and maturity to make their own decisions about taking part in a particular research study, but who are still considered to be minors in their domestic legal system. In that sense, assessing competence is important. It's not only a formal assessment. Assessing competence objectively is actually a challenge, and neuroscience could be useful in this sense. A neurobiological state advances maturity and capacity to understand become more valid, as well as the importance of the individual autonomy. The neurobioethical idea to identify molecules working as capacity markers is really fascinating, both for capacity assessment and for capacity enhancement. I refer specifically to the studies identifying laminin alpha 5 as the molecule capable to make the brain to switch from incompetent to competent, according to the working document. So we could finally, in that way, have certainty about individual competence and accelerate neurobiological processes to improve capabilities and make minors competent easily and quickly. This is only a possibility in the future, since there is currently no gold standard to test objectively the capacity to consent, but it poses important questions from an ethical and legal point of view. And the most important is, are the age criteria useless or unjust, given this possibility to assess by other ways? To answer, we should first of all keep in mind that autonomy in decision-making requires ethical, practical evaluation of the situation, not only potential capacity to understand and decide. Personal capabilities cannot be reduced to brain function, measurable and adjustable. Experiences, relationships, and maturity are important aspects to take into account, and they can be developed only through real life. For example, in cases of chronic disease, ill minors can have more experience and capacity to understand the risks, burdens, and benefits of a clinical trial than a healthy adult subject. But is always a question of time spent dealing with the illness, with the practical situation. In this sense, minors gradually mature and develop their capacity to make autonomous decisions over the years. And age criteria should not be considered only conventional rules, but reflect the ethical value of real life, time spent dealing with the illness. In addition, we must take into account that age means time spent with other persons. Opinions of close persons, such as parents or friends, are really important in the decision-making process, notably with regard to minors and adolescents. So the importance of environment already highlighted during the morning. Competence is thus improved through the years by living together with others, educating, learning information, experiences challenges and pain, achieving goals. Scientists are developing tools to measure understanding and choosing capacities in vulnerable people, including minors, and neurobiological standards are very relevant. However, time remains the most important indicator to mark personal development for a cognitive, social, and emotional point of view. Age criteria do not fulfill only a formal legal requirement, but they are the result of this important awareness that people grow in the time, living with others, and that neurobiological enhancement can support but not replace personal achievements. This means that tools developed to assess individual capacity to give informed consent using neurobiological standards can be usefully used to complete the framework of markers, but cannot totally replace the value of time spent living real life. In conclusion, about capacity assessment, we can say that if neurobiological criteria are taken into account together with other parameters, it could be a good way. The important thing is that the most relevant issues are about the capacity enhancement, because by this way we could involve in clinical trials minors actually not able to understand, only enhanced by a neurobiological point of view. Thank you, and I give the floor to
Thank you. My part concerns soldiers and prisoners as vulnerable groups. And in my contribute, I suggest to go towards an integrated definition of autonomy, including neuroscience perspective. And from this point of view, a space is open to deepen the need and the role of informed consent. And I'm going to read my text as well. Soldiers and prisoners have some elements in common and also some differences, which could be useful for considerations regarding our research about informed consent. First, I want to underline that as far as soldiers are concerned, it is already known that the case of DNA picks soldiers for clinical research and not only in a totalitarian context. Soldiers, as underlined in the working document, though technically fully autonomous individuals, they must follow orders, and this creates a tension overlooked and in a need to be addressed with more attention. So this is our focus following the working document. And in addition to this aspect, we can say that soldiers also undergo a specific control of rules, governing not only their military work, but also their bios. We use the Greek expression. For example, when we speak about a high level of physical resistance or controlled sleep-wake rhythm, etc. Moreover, we can say that the possibility of cognitive and other enhancers, in order to better reach their aim as party of an army, for example, it represents a form of direct intervention on personal neurobiological autonomy. On the other hand, regarding prisoners, notwithstanding the prohibition of torture, we can observe that some difficult conditions of the detention can exceed a just use of force and lead to consider them a vulnerable group for the control of their psychological and physical order. Enforced medical treatment and a bipolitical treatment of detainees can just be recalled here because we don't have time to focus on this aspect, because the topic is broader than what we can be debating in this contribution. But we shall notice here that in the case of prisoner, it is the main difference with a group of soldiers. we face structurally enforced actions. It is a key difference between soldiers and prisoners. And now, starting from these premises, we can draw some ethical and legal consideration about this topic. From an ethical point of view, besides general consideration about military enhancement, on which we refer to some opinions by the National Bioethics Committee in Italy, the intervention on the neurobiological dimension presupposes a form of control and decision on the dimension of decision-making itself. A soldier can be used apart from his individuality. And we cannot use here the pronoun because, as considered in the working document, in the majority of cases, soldiers are many. For example, we can consider the future but possible hypothesis of shaping decisions through a cognitive enhancer to achieve a better result in a war situation. And in this aspect, it is necessary, in our opinion, to develop the definition of autonomy, including even the neurobiological level. In other words, in addition to ensure that the patient is capable of processing the information given, reflecting on it and reaching a reasonable conclusion. This is what it's said in the working document about the fourth definition of autonomy. It can be suggested to include the condition at starting from the neurobiological level to decide validly, either free from control of others and also of authority. And if not, to be given the possibility of choosing the necessary integration of help. There is the need to introduce or improve the role of informed consent as a condition for autonomy itself to protect vulnerability. And this part we can refer also to the contribution of this morning when was said that neurosciences are not the last word. Here we can suggest that neuroscience cannot be considered in our perspective as the only approach, but we should work to define an approach which includes neurosciences in this definition of autonomy. And from a legal point of view, in the case of soldier, a neurobiological form of control is exercised by public authority, so that we can speak of a sort of biopolitical control, the exercise of authority on corpority. We refer here to the thinking of Foucault, just to make an example. And the authority, in this case, is in some way emptying the meaning of the bios. For example, here we can think of tortures which modify biological rhythms of the body. The case of soldiers, considered as a vulnerable group, opens the space for informed consent, defending and promoting neurobiological autonomy. For instance, informing about cognitive enhancers and giving the possibility of a refusal, a kind of conscious objection, as proposed in the working document. Even a right to cognitive liberty can be promoted as a way to defend neurobiological autonomy. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for hosting us here in this very stimulating debate. So in the project, in the I Consent project, I mostly focus on gender issue and the interactions between multiculturalism and gender issues and the relevance of these aspects in order to improve the informed consent process. And so the contribution I will be discussing today is mainly based on an overview of soft law instruments, namely, let's say, international and European guidelines. So the perspective of international bioethics committees and also national bioethics committees is strongly taken into consideration in this kind of approach, also in order to broaden our perspectives concerning these issues. So there are a number of social and cultural aspects which may challenge the notion of autonomy and fuel vulnerabilities in the informed consent process. Some of which are also directly closely linked, connected to gender issues. For example, in some cultural contexts, women tend to delegate decisions concerning their health, male family member, or the family group. In a number of societies, therefore, the community is the entity in terms of which the individual is identified. The leaders of the community may make decisions on behalf of its members and of the communities, and these are not often questions and discussed out of respect due to them because of their wisdom, of their age, and also due to the fact that they're deemed to be sort of guarantors of knowing what is best for the community. So therefore, it is difficult to align the principle of autonomy of individuals as enshrined in Article 5, for instance, of the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, with specific cultural settings where communal autonomy may be taught to prevail under specific circumstances. For this reason, a number of international guidelines in the field of bioethics debate about the possibility of a communal consent, alongside, of course, the traditional individual consent under specific circumstances, and whenever we deal with research participants of specific cultural backgrounds. The expression of an individual wish clashing with these decisions can be difficult sometimes, or also impossible, either out of fear of negative consequences for the individual, such as social stigma, for example, or out of respect, as I said before, for the leader of a community. So there are cultural contexts where the community dimension may coerce women into participating or not participating in clinical trials, affecting their freedom to decide. We have talked even this morning about the importance of the principle of freedom in the process of autonomy and of decision-making. So there are a number of circumstances in which they could become vulnerable in research, such as studies with female workers, for example, trafficked women, refugees, and also asylum seekers. And then there are other cases where, for instance, pregnant women's participation in research with the prospect of direct benefits for the health of their fetus may be problematic, because there may be communities or societies in which cultural beliefs place greater importance on protecting the fetus than the woman's health. So in these circumstances, women may feel coerced into enrolling or not enrolling in research, and avoiding undue inducement to pregnant women to take part in research with potential benefits to the fetus, but not to the woman herself, is essential. And it also requires putting in place and performing effective communication strategies to adequately assess the degree of voluntariness involved in the woman's decision. And this is another very challenging aspect. So seeking consent from an individual is necessary, even if the community is consulted. But the actual value of the consent of such individual, once the community has given its approval or disapproval, often raises concern. Nevertheless, such reasons should not lead to the conclusion that cultural considerations pave the way to situations where, exceptionally, for members of some groups, communal autonomy may override individual autonomy. Conversely, we should always bear in mind that respect for cultural diversity and pluralism should not be used to infringe fundamental freedoms, nor any of the principles set out in the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. So in this perspective, the Italian National Bioethics Committee, for instance, suggests an interpretation of the concept of autonomy in terms of relational autonomy, which may be better tailored to an intercultural approach aimed at accommodating the value of the community dimension in certain cultural settings, for instance, specific African tribes, and respect for the person at the same time, in order to reach this balance. In the context of research participation, a woman living in a social context of patriarchal authority, therefore having sometimes a low literacy level, may adopt a passive behavior with regard to enrollment procedures, or not seek or be reluctant to seek interaction with researchers in case of inadequate understanding of the study development. So these women may become particularly vulnerable beyond their hesitancy or inability to ask questions, also because they may suffer negligence or harm due to their submission to authority, and have a cultural tendency, inclination to deny or tolerate pain and suffering. And so these assumptions, these cultural elements should be taken into consideration during the informed consent process and communication strategies. An appropriate awareness of these social and cultural factors is of paramount importance for informed consent. So the investigator should exercise special care in handling the consent process to ensure adequate time and also a proper environment is given in which a decision to participate can be made. And an ethical consideration of informed consent must focus on comprehension, of course, and free consent, as both elements are an essential part of the person's self-determination. So those in charge of providing information should be aware also of the participants' beliefs and values during the informed consent process, and also seek feedback on effective communication strategies in terms of clarity and understandability of the information, also by conducting evaluations in different cultural communities. Other ethical challenges may stem from the fact that in clinical research and medical practice, it is necessary to document in a written form, as we have stressed this morning, that consent has been obtained. But nevertheless, the implementation of this request is likely to face a number of challenges in certain situations. For example, in societies with an oral tradition, where the value of oral consent is unquestionable. Therefore, written form consents can be considered as a lack of trust or even as an insult. Or also in illiterate groups of people, where, for instance, a sign at the bottom of a page may not reflect a real agreement with the contents of the document. So there is wide recognition that, in principle, despite the need of making efforts towards the possibility of obtaining written consent, based on the context, it is appropriate to explore also other ways of proving that consent has been actually and consciously being expressed. So advancement in neuroscience enable to better understand the functioning of the brain and its relationship with thought and behavior, as well as connections between emotions and rationality in human decisions, as we have stressed this morning. But many of the findings in this field link neuronal activity with thought and behavior. However, they also highlight problematic issues related to the reliability of results, especially with regard to the ability to extrapolate generalizations and interpret results. So particularly attention should also be given to the risk of neurological reductionism and determinism, namely the idea that human identity is reduced to the sum of cognitive capabilities and human behavior, explainable only on the basis of neural correlates and brain functions, and also to the elaboration of new philosophical models for our understanding of human beings. At the same time, however, neuroscience can represent an interesting opportunity to give new contributions to the bioethical debate on fostering our knowledge of the ways through which decisions are made in different cultural contexts, by identifying cultural biases, both in the physician, in the investigator, and also in research participants and in patients, and improving our understanding of different modes of filtering information in individuals which come from different social cultural backgrounds, in order to adapt the informed consent process to these specificities whenever dealing with patients or research participants from different culture. This is all the more important given that individuals may be directly harmed by mistrust and misconception towards their ethnic, cultural, and religious belongings. which also represent important dimensions of their individual identity and expression of their personality. This directly affects the necessary respect for the human person and his or her freedom. As a matter of fact, the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity of 2001 recalls that the defense of cultural diversity is an ethical imperative, inseparable from respect of human dignity. In sum, we are not only our brains or biology, neither only our emotions or social or cultural belongings, but a unique combination of all these dimensions. So the environment and human relations, experiences developed in specific contexts impact our perceptions and share our behaviors in an original manner, which cannot be explained exclusively at the level of neurobiological activity. So I will approach the conclusion. And so we should always keep in mind the richness and uniqueness of personal identity, which can never merely be standardized through cause-effect processes, despite common traits that human beings share. So an adequate interpretation of the notion of human dignity cannot overlook this assumption. Nevertheless, neuroscience findings can certainly help to improve the physician or the researcher's understanding of perception or behaviors in diverse cultures and help to facilitate the communication process. Thank you for your attention.
And now it's Maria Cubillo, who's going to slide.
I think the remote should be there.
Okay, can I take it and come here?
Sure. Do you want to speak over there or will you speak here? Oh, your place. Okay.
It works from here?
That's right.
Okay, good evening. Well, obviously I'm not an expert on this field, so I just do a very little small literature review about when can we affirm that one is autonomous or competent, and a little about cultural biases, which is a part that GSK is collaborating in the task 1.4. So about competence, competence is a threshold concept, and the threshold between competence or incompetence to consent is determined by the abilities that enable the patients to provide a valid informed consent. So the main ability to consider in this threshold is the capacity to make rational decisions, the decision-making capacity, which involves the ability to absorb, understand, and retain information and knowledge, the ability to manipulate that cognitive information critically, the freedom of will, and the ability of self-express. So the problem arises when trying to use these instruments to test the presence of competence that are not widely accepted, and there is a lack of evidence of validity. Normally said is relative to the abilities of cognitively typical people in our society, so that the great majority of those who are cognitively typical are considered competent to provide the informed consent. In Western societies, there has always been a high concern about upholding the value of individual autonomy, where people have the right and the ability to decide their own life, their interpersonal relationships, etc. However, in the field of medicine, has always been dominated by a culture of paternalism until the last quarter of the 20th century, where it has gone a step forward to embrace a culture of respect for autonomy, where informed consent obviously takes an important role, and it's essentially sought from patients and research subjects. About the types of errors that medical professionals are faced when determining competence or incompetence to a patient, this type of errors can be false negatives when they decide that a patient is not competent to provide informed consent when that patient really is, or false positives when they decide that a patient is not competent to consent when otherwise that patient is not competent. So the way to manage these errors are two. You can be strict in applying the standards of decision-making process, and these before accepting someone is competent to consent, where most false positives will be avoided by allowing more false negatives. Or on the other hand, applying more tolerant standards, where most false negatives will be deleted by allowing more false positives. So the most typical approach in Western societies, they tend to apply the second one, the more tolerant standards, because they believe to be better to allow people who are not competent to be considered as competent, rather than declining competence for someone who really is. This is explained by placing a high value on individual autonomy, as I said before. So concerning neuroscience and informed consent, scientists are beginning to understand how emotions and subjective values are manifested in the brain during the decision-making process. This may be useful to identify the neural correlates of the decision-making for the purposes of informed consent, and this knowledge may lead to the development of accurate neural tests of decision-making competence necessary to provide a valid informed consent that are easy to perform and not too expensive. So if these advances in neuroscience keep growing, it is important to think about the consequences of an accurate neural test of competence to provide informed consent. One of the consequences would be that there will be less patients where competence is uncertain. Another consequence would be that the rules that state that competence to consent is valid at a particular age will no longer be suitable, because if these neuroscientific tests reveal that many people at younger ages are able to consent, or on the contrary, that other people with the legal age are not competent yet, then it wouldn't be suitable. Also, a lot of circumstantial factors that has also been discussed this morning, such as emotional factors like love sickness, overeating, depression, or being overly stressed, would also affect the decision-making capacity. And this kind of test, the neuroscientific test, would be able to reveal it. Concerning now a bit about the cultural and implicit bias, well, there is an existing unconscious bias and stereotyping that lead to the difficulties in communicating enrollment and informed consent process when other cultures and populations are involved. It has been seen that when healthcare professionals have the appropriate time to process the information, enough cognitive resources, and the required motivation to avoid bias and prejudices, the care attention they provide is equal within different patients and is not influenced by this implicit bias. However, these implicit attitudes can influence in the behavior and cognitions when the cognitive process capacity is altered by factors such as anxiety, stress, illness, fatigue, cognitive overload. So moreover, in this context, when cognition capacity is loaded too much, people are more likely to stereotype and follow automatic categorizing due to the memory being biased towards implicit attitudes difficult to override. For this reason, it is important to take this into account in clinical or medical contexts, because in these kind of situations, it is easy to be under stress or to be under time pressure and working memory that can lead to a cognitive overload and thus to a biased behavior. Another study stated that implicit racial bias in favor of white people over blacks showed less patient-centered attitudes in clinicians, with a less emotional tone and negative communication that rated as poor the care of the visit. A lot of different studies that were conducted in different countries also found evidence of existing implicit bias among healthcare professionals using different testing methods and studying various socio-demographic characteristics. The results show that the higher the level of implicit bias was, the poorer was the quality of care. Obviously, there is clear evidence for a relationship between the implicit bias and negative effects on patient interaction. But although this not always has to mean a bad treatment, the truth is that a good relationship between patient and healthcare professional is crucial to provide a good treatment. Also, results have shown that the majority of implicit race bias are favorable to whites over blacks, and that these attitudes are different between males or females, healthcare professionals, being stronger for males. How can we suggest to address this kind of implicit bias, or what are the interventions that are mainly suggested? Implicit bias can be considered as an automatic association between two terms, cue, response. So it has been shown that it's more effective to try to change the association rather than trying to change the response itself, because implicit bias is difficult to control as it is implicit. And even if physicians are convinced to consciously reduce their perceptions, it is not guaranteed that they are deleted and they can reappear after again. In this way, there are some findings where, for example, admired African Americans are presented to white people, and afterwards implicit bias is reduced. This technique needs to be translated obviously into clinical contexts, but it suggests a possible way to address this type of bias. Another possible intervention could be to address the stereotype threat that some patients have, which have been shown that may alter patient-researcher communication, and thus increase mistrust. Actions that decrease patients' insights of threat are needed. So in this way, self-affirmation is the process where the self-integrity values are affirmed, and it's sometimes used in educational fields to decrease racial issues. Thereby, self-affirmation could help the implicit bias, to reduce the implicit bias and improve also the patient-researcher relationship. Emerging research has shown that explicit cognition can be used to control and mitigate the implicit attitudes. Considering this, one of the strategies suggested for healthcare professionals is to change the categorization of the patients, focusing on a shared common identity. In this way, the healthcare professionals could ask questions about other social identities such as hobbies or interests or occupation, and shifts his or her attention from the patient's race or ethnicity. This can help to inhibit the implicit negative stereotypes. And moreover, another strategy for reducing the activation of implicit bias can be taking the perspective of the other side, in this case, the minority group. Some findings have shown that when a person imagines to be in the difficult situation of the other side, he or she is more likely to be empathic and adopt a more approving conception as a result. Some workshops that train this involve to view a picture of a minority group and write down a story where they spend a day in the life of that patient. So, and the last intervention, there is also evidence that increasing the diversity of the healthcare professionals also help to reduce racial and ethnic biases. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Legal question. The bias is basically the healthcare professionals have a bias against patients or is it
Both
ways? Okay.
that
Those
we
are-
are here in our material. I have only studied the bias by the investigator. But I have read that obviously it's both sides.
So now we have basically how much time for questions?
Well,
Until,
let's say we go to the-
okay, around 4 o'clock.
Yes.
Okay, so 20 minutes. Someone has questions?
Thank you very much. Well, to begin with, I think it's good to see how some keywords, from anxiety to culture and so forth, that started appearing in the morning, somehow sum up in this final session, precisely because it's the I consent one. So we're kind of all moving in the same directions, and this is positive to begin with, in mere practical terms. There have been many interesting inputs, and I want to thank you for also your written contribution that, of course, put me in an advantageous position because I was able to read and therefore study. I will start with Alberto's touch upon a couple of issues that I noticed, and of course we can discuss it here or in the future, given that we are all involved in the same project. Concerning your talk and this relevance to point D and the cultural bias and the way it integrates, I think we discussed maybe this already, but we want to share. There is this interesting article called "Culture Wires the Brain: A Cognitive Neuroscience Perspective," and basically it shows, it shows how, for example, East Asians and Westerns conceptualize categories in different ways. So, for example, this is, I think, is fascinating because if we simply think of how that can affect an I consent form, I mean, this is what we're talking. Categorization can start, with right or wrong, but it can be even more complex, of course, and that's crucial. It's crucial because, of course, then it will add on with other layers. For example, what if you are an East Asian woman? You might have a different attitude, or a Western woman or man. I mean, there are a number of combinations, but that's something that certainly has to be taken into account. And neuroscience, in a way, can be helpful, but, and this kind of links with some of the points Leonardo, I think, among the LUMSA group, more specifically rated, is how can we deal with changing the thresholds. So yes, the age limit that we have taken for granted for so long is relevant, is important, is in fact connected with another of the categories with which we define autonomy, namely that of being coherent with past decision. So if by any chance we find an 80 years old that, according to this new, not still established neurological test, to be sufficiently competent, then the question will be, is it 80 years of lifetime sufficient to assess that we can trace a level of autonomy that is satisfactory for us? And that's, of course, it's still a bit of science fiction, but as some point. One minor thing concerning Margarita's part, I'm not sure the way that you use Dios. I think you should probably use Zoe, is because it seems to me that it's something more has to do with the physical part. So even the answers is physical. It doesn't really have to do with the value, with the individual edge that you might give. So I think that might be, although, I mean, I see that it can be tempting because you connected with biopolitics, but if you want to specify it more, I think Zoe might be more accurate, in my humble opinion. And terrific job.
Okay.
Yes.
Alberto wants to answer first, or? Okay.
You agree?
I know.
Yeah.
Okay, I can.
Excellent. That's what I want.
You want to say something?
No,
about
not really.
Okay.
So I'm totally agree. I think that the work that also Loredana has been doing, it's extremely interesting also for us, the perspective you offer. And then I think by collecting all these different research, I think we can we can develop our task. For me, one of the challenges is to see to what extent these cultural bias or cultural factors should may low down very much the capacity of understanding and of comprehension and of acceptance of a clinical trial. Because of course there is diversity, but if we move diversity, we have this threshold. This is the capacity of consent for a clinical trial. Let's see, even if we then neurotechnology offer as a minimum, this is the minimum sufficient capacity. The cultural factors move, touching and crossing, reducing this to excessive, so insufficient competency, or it moves, it's diverse, but it moves, it doesn't change the basics of the nature of the intervention, of the intention of the intervention, of the consequences of the intervention. Because if you tell a Chinese or an Indian in this research, you have 100% of possibilities to die, this is going to be understood by an Indian, a Chinese, or even a Spanish guy. You're going to die. This is what something says about the transplant of the body. No? So it's almost close to 100%. So again, if the diversity moves up to the line of sufficient consent or appropriate consent, these cultural factors are not significant, and we don't have to change anything. The problem is when these factors could move up and down in the line of what is really the minimum. Because, for example, Africans, they have a comprehension of science and technology that makes them to be, in most of the cases, skeptical and to refuse experimentation. So they move. Let's see where the cultural, social-cultural factors move. It's up to the line, the threshold, or if it intersects, or it's so important that change everything.
Anyone wants to comment on Alberto?
Okay, sure.
You want to say something? No. Okay. I have two more questions.
Because it's a minor question, maybe I can tell you shortly and then we spoke again. Because here I used the word bios in a very short way because I didn't have the time to explain. But I can answer that in a certain sense. I can answer yes to your question because, for example, in the meaning of Foucault, politics or power managing the corporating the joy, for example, sexuality or the life of the body. But in another sense, I meant to use bios in a more integrated way, to starting from Aristotle. But I'm still not sure that is the same way vision of Aristotle on the bios, because he meant bios like human life. The social one, and I mean this concept including incorporating. So this is a different question. So when I refer to authority managing the bios, I refer to authority managing the corpority dividing the relation between bios and identity, so reducing the bios to the human life. So I'm not sure it's clear. It's very,
Okay.
very shortly and
Yeah, I just
Yeah,
felt
far
like
from,
mentioning it because I
yeah,
know this.
of course.
But yeah.
Thank you.
I wasn't here this morning, but I think this point might have been raised this morning. I mean, you also mentioned it. It's the question of, I don't know. It seems like neuroscience that you seems like that one test can tell you whether you are competent or not. It seems too simplistic, right? Or a chemical, a drug I give you, then you become competent, right? It seems like a little bit reducing the whole idea of consenting to a very mechanical understanding is like of reaching a threshold, because I thought like decision making or consent requires so much more. I mean the human mind, the whole thing. So I'm just wondering, isn't there? I mean I think you mentioned it as well, but isn't it a little bit reductive to make it all into one test or one chemical that make you able to cross the threshold? I mean, I'm just a general question. Not sure whether, especially Leo, maybe.
Yes. The problem, I think, I'm a lawyer too, so the problem is the problem of certainty. Okay, and the neurobiological standards are actually certain, but reductive, as you say. I think also the time criterion is not so complete, but more complete than the neurobiological standard. So I think it's conventional, but nevertheless it takes into consideration a lot of factors, personal, emotional, developmental, and so on, that the chemical threshold cannot take into account. In addition, we can say that also the chemical neurobiological thresholds should be conventional. So the scientific community should decide which is the threshold of the molecule taken into account to understand if a minor is competent or not. So I think that the value of time spent in real life for dealing with the illness in the case of clinical trials or clinical practice is actually the most relevant at the moment.
Actually, this morning, so some of the neuroscientists and some of the people involved more the scientific side were the lawyers' side. They told us that yes, there is some test, neural test, that can help. They shouldn't be the last word. They are not scientifically speaking a guarantee, but that can help. And in that case, if these neural tests can be supportive of the evaluation of the capacity of the subject of experimentation, we could propose that when possible, these two tests should be done, especially when there is no evidence or no clarity, there's doubts about the capacity of someone to participate in the research. But they emphasize, and they are the scientists, from a non-reductionist point of view, that it's only something to support something else, not to make the test the determinant of you are competent you are not. And I don't know if Father Alberto is most of the scientists, because under the suit of a priest, he is also a biotechnology, biotechnologist. So you can explain that for better if I understood well.
Yeah, this morning we consider an I guess, reductionistic vision of the brain. So Armando Piccini told us about the embedded brain. So, and also we try to integrate a vision of informed consent that is not like a monolithic vision of a single event, but a process that we have to consider also internal, external factors. So we heard external factors as culture, society, but also the tension between patients and family members, for example, or the patients and his cultural values or beliefs. And another point is like, for example, the use of pharmacology. For example, if a person has hallucination, maybe he's not so competent to give like an informed consent on some special treatment. So, but we can use pharmacological treatment in order to take side or take off hallucination in order to balance their problem, and so making some normality, or like the patient could be competent in order to give some informed consent, or a better informed consent on a special treatment. Or so pharmacology based on neuroscientific evidence could be very helpful in order to balance this neurochemical imbalance. But as we heard, Armando said that there's no pharmacological treatment or neurotechnological treatment in order to improve actually nowadays the competence, because there's not so they're not only cognitive impairment but also emotional.
Because there was one of the things that Leo said was about this chemical. I was a little bit concerned about that, not just to take this chemical and then
The pills.
I mean, that was kind of the idea.
Informed consent pills.
Yeah, informed consent pills, right? The other question I wanted to ask is kind of delicate. It's about the relationship between child and parent. Even if the child, let's say in the case of a child being competent according to this new criteria, and he or she refuses further treatment against the parental wishes, right? What would you do then? Like, I mean, that would be, or one way or the other way around, right? She wants a treatment, the parents said no, or she wants not to have treatment. The parents would say yes, and she should get the treatment. Okay, it's not just a question of competence there. It's a question of, I guess, who decides what is the best thing for the child, right? The child himself or herself can decide that, or the parents or the guardians are the one who decide for the child. So I just want to know what your response to that would be.
Thank you for the question. It's a little bit challenging, but I think we first of all distinguish between clinical practice, clinical treatment, and clinical trials. Because in clinical treatment, validated, I mean, there is a benefit with the scientific evidence for the minor. And so I think the minor's autonomy can be overridden, yes, by his best interest as parents or the physician or the tribunal also can assess this best interest. In the case of clinical trials, there is another problem, that is the balance of risks and benefits. And clinical trials, as they are not validated treatment, have usually a higher risk levels. So I think, according also to my studies about soft law and hard law, that in that case, if the minor is considered competent, his wishes have to be taken into account as binding. So his objection is definitive. Instead, if there is a clinical treatment, the rule is the other one. The best interest, the beneficence prevails over the autonomy.
And in addition to that, the minor or the people not able to consent in biomedical research that has been accepted by their legal representative, it can be carried out, this kind of experimentation, when the person not able to consent do not refuse. If he refuses, the legal representative should not allow to participate, especially if the research is not for the direct benefit of the subject. This is according to the European Convention, the Oviedo Convention, and the protocol on biomedical research, that there is an extra protection of the minor or people not able to consent when the research has not a direct benefit. And on the other hand, the other condition is the existence of what is called in the legal terms minimal risk and minimal burden. And are the parents or the legal representatives the one that have the legal responsibility to assess the existence of this minimal risk and minimal burden based on the information that the physician, the researcher provides?
Okay, I think we move on to the next session. I think our questions are.
The next session is the coffee.
It's 5 o'clock.
Final session.
There's from 4 to 5. There's something
Coffee
else.
break,
Unless you want to keep on.
We have something.
Conclusions.
No conclusion.
Questions. I mean, this is Mirko, or who decides? Mirko?
Okay, I decided.
Bravo.
I love democracy.
I decided.
You're the competent.
Well, I'll try. Anyway, when Alberto referred to this, this pharmaceutical enhancement of competence after hallucination just now, I wouldn't have thinking of the case that the Singleton case that I have investigated, I written in the book as well, where their drugs were used to reestablish competence in order to kill the person. So there is very vivid how much the social dimension of competence was necessary there. I mean, it's true that the person Singleton did lose his hallucination, which I'm sure was very positive for him, but then it ended up being executed. Anyway, aside from this digression, I think we might just conclude as this very much. Alberto wants to say something.
Only to ask you a short opinion about, in page 4 of the working document, about concerning minors and this laminin alpha 5 that could help to enhance or to give the capacity to the non-competent to become competent by using this molecule. So, do you think that from an ethical point of view, should be allowed, tolerate, permitted or even mandatory to say, okay, in this specific situation, the researcher should propose the minor or the legal representative to make this transition from non-competency to competency by using this laminin alpha 5. What do you think from a legal point of view? So the option should be their legal representative, their parents, will take the decision. So do not put in motion using a drug or a molecule, something that is going to come later, but today the patient, the minor, is not abandoned because someone else can take the decision on behalf of him for his or her best interest. This is one option. The other option is, no. Since we are so very close to get competency, let's give him or her this drug, this molecule, to allow him or her to cross the threshold.
That's exactly the critique. I said you cannot just take a drug and arrive at the threshold. That's my critique. I don't think you can do that.
Why?
But that depends.
Why?
If it is
Depends if it's like a psychiatric disorder.
Yeah, okay, that I can
Okay.
understand, right? But
Okay.
in this case, it's more like
It's like enhancement.
yeah, it's an enhancement. Say that I
It's like
take a
as
drug,
experimental
but
drugs.
competency is not like I don't know. It's not one thing. That's what I'm complaining. That I didn't think that you can say competency threshold is one thing, right? So it's being reductive. That's what I'm saying. In taking a drug, then you can become a causal threshold. It's like for me that is absolutely reductive to the whole idea of how someone become competent. It's not just one thing. It's so many things involved. I don't know. That's my original question when I said a chemical or a test can tell you if someone's competent or not. I think that is a bit reductive.
Well, I agree partially.
Yeah.
But because I agree because I consent is like a multidimensional concept. There's different type of level and dimension. But if I have a drug that could balance one aspect or one dimension, that is the dimension that allows you to be more competent. So, is it ethical or not? But I guess that from the clinical point of view, if you are, it depends from the drug, so obviously. But if I take drugs in order to be better in my disease, and so I have more competence to make a decision of a special treatment, I guess we have to.
I mean, for me, I mean, there is a paradox here. I mean, who is competent to decide whether I should receive that drug or not, right? Like, because if I'm not competent enough to decide, I cannot be given the drug. I mean, then you're saying that someone else should decide for me to make me more. I mean, there's a paradox there.
Yeah.
If
The problem, the real problem, because if you are assessed as non-competent, this is the case, even if near to the threshold, is not a drug that can make you competent. And the other problem is who decides to receive this drug. But if there is a mental impairment, this is another topic, because the drug becomes therapy. Okay. Instead, in the other case, is enhancement beyond therapy, as the President Commission defined it. And so I think it's not, from a legal point of view, I'm almost certain of that, because the neurobiological standard is not taken into consideration as a certain mark. But also from an ethical point of view, I think is an issue to consider competent one minor that was not competent for sure without having the drug. Related to age issues, not to mental illness or something like that.
Yeah, because we have to figure out an example, because if I have to give an informed consent, for what? For a treatment, for experimentation, research,
to participate in a clinical trial. To participate in a clinical trial.
In clinical trial.
I'm not, I don't know about this molecule specifically, but let's talk about another example that is not this molecule. It's to take hormones to develop your muscles or your strength, the kind of vitamins. It's more physical than mental. Do we have, from an ethical point of view, doubts that the use of this kind of vitamin to enhance, it's not to enhance the physical capacity and the bodily capacities of my children is wrong or is right? And if we can compare these hormones, the use of this hormone from an ethical point of view, in comparison with this laminin that is promising, it's experimental, but it's promising that perhaps this could make you cross the threshold of competency. Let's see if this is an evidence. But if it is, as today it is the hormones that make you to grow muscles and to grow the size of the body, is this right or wrong? And in that case, if so, could we apply the same reasoning to the use of this drug? This is bodily.
No, I guess no, it's not.
Why?
It cannot. No.
Why?
Because it's very different. Because one is physical. So when you are competent to decide about your growth, you can decide, right? But in this case, you're incompetent, so you're not, in this incompetence, you cannot decide whether you should take this competent drug. So it's kind of like a vicious circle.
In that case, it's the parents.
Yeah,
Say, okay, the parents say, okay, so this 11-year-old is not competent now,
right?
But the physicians are saying that he's almost in the threshold.
Right. I mean,
why don't
there are two
they
problems. The first problem is whether the drug really is efficient, which I have my doubts, but that's a different question.
Yeah, this is what.
Let's say if it is efficient, then I mean, it's the case of saying that this treatment or this experiment can only be done on the minor if the minor himself consents to it, right? That the parents cannot consent on his behalf, right? So that's the only case, because otherwise the parents can just decide on it.
The parents always have the capacity to decide
on
behalf of the minor.
What's the added value?
The added value is to offer the children to increase his or her capacity to decide by his or herself with the subsidiary support of the legal representative.
So let's say you give the patient the drug, the patient could say yes, which basically is okay, or you can say no, and then you don't go through.
Yeah, this is the question of the point number one. That is, so I'm provoking because we are trying to discuss about this and to compare when similar or analogous things, we don't see much problem in regard to new drugs, molecules, or procedures that could have an incidence or an utility for this. I'm not saying, I'm just saying it's right to do it, but let's think about it and to reason why yes or why not. And for me, in that case, in respect probably of the human dignity of the children, instead of giving a drug, it's okay, let's go to keep the responsibility of the parents until the time in which naturally the children will acquire the full competency or competency. So there is no reason, because there is nothing at risk in principle, because their parents or his or her parents are going to take the decision to allow the participation in this clinical trial for the benefit of the best interest of him. And then the risk about the efficiency of the drug, even when tested, I don't think that legitimates this kind of treatment to improve or enhance, it's not improve, to acquire capacity. On the other hand, because it's more than efficiency, it's how you can keep the use of this molecule, I would say, stable in the time. It's not to be enhanced, to understand, comprehend, to be alert, and then sign. And bye-bye. You have to keep this kind of competency in the medium and long term as something that the children will keep for the future. So it's a kind of biological or mental maturity that he will acquire in a definitive way. Today in the clinic, there is already the challenge of the minore maturo, the mature minor. That is not, from the legal point of view, is something that is not, I think, in Italy, something that is 11 years. You have 18 to go to vote. You have 16, you can get married with deception, according to the civil code. But the minore maturo, the minor, could be 13, could be 12, could be 14, depending on the subject. My question is, to what extent neurotechnology can help to make a more accurate evaluation that this girl or boy of 12, 13, or 15, it's really capable, and it's really sufficiently mature to accept the treatment or even to accept the participation in the clinical trial, knowing that we know that the parents can take in a subsidiary way the decision to participate, but allowing him or her even to refuse and to give value to his or her refusal. That is a legal condition that today established also the European regulation.
Okay, so I'll follow your provocation and also your latter addition. Let's try to touch a few points. So you mentioned hormones as an example of this announcement. It came to my mind the example of Lionel Messi. Some of you might have heard of this guy. And he was given growth hormone at a certain moment in his life, and he was used in a therapeutic sense. But first of all, of course, he was not suffering a condition that was jeopardizing his life per se. What he was suffering was the fact that he was not growing enough in accordance to a standardized height. Okay, so already in there is an acceptance by the parents and so forth to choose what was best for him. Namely, I mean, it's very unlikely that if he would not have been given the growth hormone, he would have become the champion that we all admire nowadays. So also, like, aside from becoming a billionaire and so forth, but just to have a sufficiently happy life, we would imagine. So in that, it was a rather important choice, even though it was certainly more physically oriented, then we would imagine a scenario where, wanting it or not, we would be giving, okay, in that case it was not a clinical trial, but we could assume for sake of argument that it was. And I think that afterwards we would all agree that the parents did well and they did it and so forth. But the same thing for competence, assuming that that someone could be possible. I think that we have this tendency to imagine, despite the fact that you were saying, okay, you give integrators, vitamins, whatever to become more strong. Of course, that will shape who you will be. Because if, as a child, your parents, for example, it's very common nowadays, if you tend to be from a wealthy and often well-educated family, it's more likely that since you're a child, because of the studies that we have available, you will have a certain diet that will increase the chances for you to be well predisposed for sports or in general to be healthy. So that's a sort of what Nicolas Agar calls environmental enhancement. So that's why it could work genetically and so forth. But to try to sort of make this parallel with a less theoretical scheme, I was just thinking, let's imagine, for example, that we could establish, again, with a test that is not available, but let's say that we would establish that if we have the capability to have, I don't know, I really have no idea how it works, Alberto might help here, but say to have 30,000 synapses active in our brain at a certain given moment when asked to make a choice, we established that that's the number that we require for an individual to be competent, okay? And let's say that on average, we have found out that a person would reach that number around 18. Some would at 16, some would at 15, some would at 45, never, no, but the most, okay? And we do have, thanks to this molecule or others, we have a chance to increase this number. And now the question, in my opinion, would then be, but the fact that I'm able practically to have this active will be sufficient? And I completely agree with what came out. Probably not. And the reason is what came out also with Leonardo and what was mentioned is the age-related aspect has also to do with experience. So it's not only if you can do something, but do you understand? And I think, for example, one aspect, I'm definitely not a lawyer, but I think sexual activity that has decreased, the age of sexual activity, which of course from a certain point of view can be and should be considered competence, has decreased, at least in the Western world. But often, I think you refer to this possibility of being married at 16. I think, I don't know if in Italy, but for example, in Israel, I know that there is 5 years. So you can be 16, but he or she can be 23. No, yeah, 20. God, my maths is 21. Sorry. Thank you. Anyway, there might be like 5-year gaps is the maximum. So in one way or another, I think that the reasoning behind there is that in some sense you might be sharing the same level of life experience, same level of competence, if you like. I know that is a very vague concept that I'm sharing it with you, but that's what we are doing. We are sharing these views. So I think that's interesting, and I don't know, link to further questioning.
The only thing about enhancement, let's say if it's possible, competence enhancement, I think I would be against it also because, I mean, it's not just one decision you're making. It's basically you making a child precociously mature at an age that is not like, I mean, you want a 12-year-old to have the competence of an 18-year-old, but then it's not just that one decision, it's his life, right? And his relationship with his peers, school, with parents. I mean, if he can decide about that, he can decide about other things. That I'm going to do this. He can tell me no because I'm old enough to decide for my own, right? So there are many other consequences that you also have to take into account, not just that one decision about informed consent, but anything else. So I think it's also unfair to the child to push him 5 years advance when he could enjoy that 5 years of childhood. I think it's also valuable. I mean, once again, I mean, you can see that in many things, right? In sports and things like that. Certain people have a certain, I mean, differences in age, but then if you push them too hard, they might lose. They might gain something, but they might lose a lot more, right? So that's the other thing.
Yeah, especially if the only reason to give this kind of enhancer is the participation in a clinical trial. Because it could be other major reasons, perhaps, to justify this kind of burden, some ages, some years, could be all. But to participate in a clinical trial, that also creates, for me, many doubts. But anyway, we will examine all these insights, comments, suggestions that the experts and all of you that we have been participating in this workshop we have offered today. I thank you very much for your participation. Hoping to see you soon in another event, or have a coffee or a pizza whenever you come here to Rome, or we travel to Spain or other places. So if there is no more suggestions or ideas, Jaime, would you like to, as coordinator, member of the coordination team, to give us some comments or insights?
One of the main questions that I was doing myself about the paper Mirko sent to me, it was just about all these
Alpha 5.
Okay. Because in fact, I was thinking that if you have a mirror that is not competent, and you're in a clinical trial, the normal thing is you pick one that is competent, and you don't have the problem of giving him something that you don't know what is going to happen. Because we have to think that we are understanding the informed consent as a process. So he has to be competent during all the process. I don't know how this Laminia 5 works, or you have to be giving this several times to be able to be competent during all the process. So I don't understand it. Or we are just reducing the informed consent to sign the form, and that's it. So I think that we are being paternalist, taking the decision for him to give him this Laminia 5 because we have decided that he's not competent to decide himself, and we are. It's because I don't understand how. So we take the decision for him to make him competent to take the decision, and after I don't really understand who takes who is able to decide in the first moment for him. We give him a lot of importance, but after we take him the importance to give it to the child. So I don't really understand where is the limit. And I'm really happy to have been able to be here today with you, because I think it's really interesting, all the workshop, and it also makes me to think about the work I did the task 1.2 about all the gender differences, because I didn't take into consideration all the neurobiological perspective, and seeing what the experts have said today about it. I think we have to also consider the gender differences in neuronal gender differences. Okay, and we have to complete that part of our previous work.
Yeah.
So thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, everybody. And anything else?
Sì. Loredana.
A very short remark. I believe there are also anthropological issues behind these notions of enhancing the brain, of course, and we should also ask ourselves what we mean also by human flourishing, and if human development is directly connected with cognitive development, because if we endorse this idea of autonomy, that we can pharmacologically control the brain of child to of course make them more autonomous, of course we are also leading to resulting in anthropological changes in the way we conceive freedom and autonomy. And of course, this also impacts our idea of human flourishing, because on one side we say that, of course, growth and development has also multidimensional aspects. We have referred to the environment, to social aspects, to cultural aspects, to human relationships that shape our perceptions. But on the other hand, then we conceive autonomy and competence according to a reductionist view, if we in a certain way put forward these kind of issues. And then I find another paradox that is a bit in line with what has been said earlier, the fact that in a certain sense we want to make children more autonomous by pharmacologically controlling their brains without even knowing the consequences, because then each and every human being has a different organism, a different biological mechanism, and so a different way of reacting to drugs. And so whenever we intervene in the brain, we have to carefully assess all the benefits and risks. So I just wanted to stress the anthropological issues that are behind this. Okay.
And taking into account also the neuro perspective of considering the development of the brain in children. So they are vulnerable people. And taking into account that a mature brain, the maturity of the brain structure is reached more or less between 18 and 22 years old. So there's a lot of interesting consideration of the different type of brain plasticity and brain development of a child brain. So we were talking 2 weeks ago with Mando and Donatella about the ethical issues on these babies that are going to perform like actors or models. So, and the parents like put their ideals and they stress or idealistic perception. And so this type of vulnerable brains. So there's a lot of effects, and there's no pharmacological, it's like social, cultural, and psychological perspective on children, for example. So there's a lot of careful using drugs in children and adolescents.
Good, thank you very much. I'm not sure if there is any administrative or logistic thing. If not, we declare closed our workshop this afternoon, and hoping to see you soon, and God bless you.